The first time I noticed her, she dropped a data tablet. That is not, on its face, a remarkable event. Personnel drop things in training yards all the time. I have dropped things in training yards. The difference was what she did after. She stood there for 3 full seconds, looking down at the tablet on the ground, with the expression of someone who had just watched a catastrophe unfold in slow motion, and I could not tell if she was going to retrieve it or simply turn around and walk back through the station bulkhead and never return. She retrieved it. She tucked it under her arm with the careful precision of someone reclaiming dignity from a public sidewalk. Then she looked straight ahead, at the far wall, and she held that posture until the color in her cheeks, which is not quite the same color as a human blush, more of a deepening in the gold, like sunlight pressing through amber, settled back to her ordinary shade. She did not look at me. I had apparently caused the tablet to fall. I have been told since that I was not doing anything in particular at the time. I was walking from the rack room to the center of the yard, carrying 2 training poles, which I do every morning at the start of primary session. I had not addressed her. I had not looked at her. I was simply present in the yard, moving in the ordinary direction things move when they are walking from one place to another. Thesavin On-Rail had been assigned to Threshold Station Kelvara as a diplomatic observer for the Velorath Compact 3 weeks before I noticed the tablet incident. I knew her name from the station manifest. I knew her rank, Junior Observer, 3rd Daughter, 3rd tier of the Compact's Diplomatic Auxiliary, which is a polite way of saying she held a position of limited consequence, given to people the Compact could assign without it costing them anything meaningful. I knew she had a formal clearance to observe Union garrison training operations as part of a bilateral exchange program that Command had approved 6 months prior, and I knew she was supposed to produce a written assessment of our methods for submission to the Compact's Defense Integration Committee. What I did not know at the time was that she could not seem to be in the same room as me without something going wrong. I learned it incrementally. Over the week following the tablet incident, I cataloged. 1 spilled cup of something warm and pale at the common table when I sat down across from 2 other instructors, and she was 3 seats away. 1 missed doorframe in the corridor outside the armory that produced a quiet, mortified sound she quickly suppressed. 1 long pause in the middle of a sentence she was delivering to my adjutant, Specialist Cora Veth, which ended when Cora gently prompted her, and she finished the sentence in a voice that had lost about half its usual precision. I mentioned it to Cora, because Cora notices things and I find her useful for context. "She's Velorath," Cora said, as if that explained it. "I know she's Velorath. Have you read anything about Velorath diplomatic observers, their composure standards?" I had not. I had read the clearance documentation and the bilateral exchange agreement, which runs to 32 pages and contains a great deal about training oversight protocols, and not a single sentence about what happens when a Velorath diplomatic observer encounters whatever it was she was encountering when she encountered me. Cora pulled the briefing material up on her terminal and pointed to a section I had skimmed. Their observers are trained from appointment to maintain what they call Anvedrath. It translates roughly as formal stillness. It's both a physical practice and a social obligation. In the context of a posting like this one, it means she's expected to observe, record, and assess without any visible reaction to what she sees. No audible responses. No personal opinions expressed aloud. No physical disruptions of the environment. "She drops things." "Yes," Cora said. "Around me specifically." "That is my observation as well." I looked at the briefing text. What happens if she fails to maintain it? Cora gave me the expression she uses when she is about to tell me something I am not going to like. The senior observer on the posting files a composure assessment report. If the assessment finds systematic failure, the observer is recalled and barred from future diplomatic postings. For dropping a tablet. For dropping it every time a specific person walks into the room. That would be considered a significant breach, yes. I thought about that. Who is the senior observer? His name is Keth Voren. He arrived 2 days ago. I thought about that too. Senior observer Keth Voren was tall even by Velorath standards, which meant he had about 6 centimeters on me, and he moved through the station with the particular stillness of someone who had been practicing on Vedrath for so long it had become his default state. He had seen perhaps 70 years, though Velorath aging is not identical to human aging, and the conversion is not straightforward. His skin was a deeper gold than Thesavin's, more bronze, and his eyes were a cool amber that did not catch light the way hers did. He observed everything with the same flat, measuring attention. He observed me with that attention. We had not spoken directly. He had acknowledged my presence with the small, formal inclination the Velorath use instead of a nod. I had returned it. That was the extent of our interaction. I watched him watch Thesavin during the secondary training session that afternoon, and I understood what Cora meant. Thesavin was standing at the observation rail on the elevated walkway above the main yard, recording the junior weapons cohort running the pole form sequence I had assigned them. She had her tablet. She was making notes. She was, by every outward measure, doing exactly what a diplomatic observer is supposed to do during a training session. Then I walked out onto the floor to demonstrate the correction for a problem I'd spotted in trainee Holt's left side pivot, and I noticed her pause in her note-taking. I did not look at her directly. I demonstrated the correction, sent Holt back through the sequence, confirmed the pivot had improved, and walked back to the edge of the floor. Behind me, the note-taking resumed. Voren, on the walkway, had not taken his eyes off her once. I went home that evening. My quarters on Threshold Station are not particularly home-like, but they serve the function, and I read everything the station library had on Velorath diplomatic culture that was available in Union Standard. It took approximately 3 hours. By the end of it, I had a clearer picture and a less comfortable evening. The Velorath Compact is, at its simplest, a warrior caste society that has never quite made peace with the fact that not everyone in it wants to be a warrior. Their diplomatic auxiliary exists because they need diplomats and they are pragmatic enough to train some. But the category of diplomat is viewed within the compact as a stepping stone at best and a concession at worst. The truly exceptional Velorath go into the military arm, the command track, the weapons track, the deep space tactical formations that the compact's senior families invest in the way other societies invest in universities. The diplomatic auxiliary gets, as one source put it with unusual candor, the remainder. Thesavin on-rail was a third daughter, third tier. The third daughter of a third-tier family, assigned as a junior observer to a mid-level Union garrison posting on a border station that most senior observers would have declined on the grounds that the bilateral exchange agreement offered limited career advancement. She was, by the compact's own internal logic, the remainder of the remainder. The person you send when you want someone competent enough to produce a passable assessment, but expendable enough that, if the posting produced nothing useful, no one important would be held accountable. I thought about that for a while. I had been running garrison training programs for 12 years. In that time, I had seen approximately 16 external evaluators pass through postings like this one. Of those 16, perhaps 4 had asked questions that went deeper than the standard assessment rubric. Thesavin had been asking those questions since week 2. The one that had prompted the counter-rotation explanation was the best one anyone had asked me in 4 years, and the follow-up she produced from that answer, the comparison to Velorath preemptive disengagement doctrine, was the kind of cross-referencing that didn't get done by people who were simply checking boxes. The same sources noted that Velorath observers assigned to postings like this one carry an additional burden. They are expected to produce assessments that can be used to argue, back home, for deeper integration with Union defense structures. This requires them to observe without prejudice and report without distortion, which sounds straightforward until you understand that the compact's internal politics make arguing for Union integration roughly equivalent to staking out a position that will earn you enemies in every senior chamber. The families who want integration are in the minority. The families who oppose it control most of the appointments. A junior observer who produces a strong pro-integration assessment does not benefit from producing it. She hands the benefit to the committee members above her who will use it, and she collects whatever falls back in the way of consequences. She had been sent, in other words, with the implicit understanding that whatever she produced would be used by people above her rank, and that whatever went wrong would attach to her name. I was not sure what I had done to disrupt her composure. I was also not sure it mattered whether I understood it. What I understood was that Keth Voren was watching her with the specific attention of someone building a file, and that whatever was causing the disruption was, apparently, me, and that it had been happening since her first week, and nothing I had done to make myself less present had changed that. I made a decision the following morning that I still think was the right one, even though it took several weeks and some significant discomfort to execute. I moved my morning routine. I began entering the training yard through the south corridor instead of the north, which meant I was not in her direct sightline for the first segment of primary session. I adjusted the timing of my floor demonstrations so that I was on the elevated walkway myself, during the periods when she was most often at the observation rail, which meant she was below me and to one side, and could not see my face. I asked Cora, as casually as I could manage, to handle any direct communications with the Velorath observers that didn't specifically require me. Cora looked at me for a moment and then said, "All right," without any particular expression. None of it worked. The tablet situation happened again, except this time it was a stylus, and this time I was 40 meters away at the far end of the yard and had not looked in her direction at all. I heard the small sound of it hitting the walkway rail and then the floor below, and I kept my eyes on the trainee I was working with, but I heard the brief, controlled exhale that followed, which was the sound of someone managing a reaction they had been trained not to show. The spilled cup happened at breakfast, at a table I chose specifically because it was on the opposite side of the mess from the Velorath observer's usual seat, and she had not yet arrived when I sat down. She came in, took her usual seat, and within 2 minutes had tipped her cup against the edge of her tray at the exact moment. She looked up and found me across the room. I cleaned my own tray up and left, which probably looked like flight, and was in fact something very close to it. "This is getting ridiculous," I said to Cora. "Yes," Cora agreed. "Have you determined anything useful?" "I've determined," Cora said, in the measured way she has when she is choosing words, "that the problem is not proximity. She was 40 meters away when the stylus went. She was 15 tables away when the cup went. Distance is not the variable." "Then what is the variable?" "You are your presence in the space specifically, not your proximity." She paused. "I've been watching her when you're not in the room. She's entirely composed. Her on-Vedrath is very good, actually. Better than I would have expected from a junior observer." That gave me something to think about. I thought about it for the rest of the morning session and arrived at the obvious conclusion, which I then spent the better part of a day resisting. She was not reacting to something I was doing wrong. I called my sister, Dane, that evening. Dane is 3 years older than me and works in agricultural logistics on Threshold Station's sister colony, 2 systems over. She has been married to the same person for 19 years and has opinions about most things, and she gives them without being asked and does not apologize for them afterward, which I have always found useful even when I have not found it comfortable. I told her the situation, in broad terms, leaving out the specifics of rank and species and diplomatic protocol, because explaining Velorath composure standards over a long-distance connection would have cost me 20 minutes and Dane would have summarized it in 2 sentences anyway. I said, "There is a person at the station who cannot seem to hold her professional composure when I am in the room, which is causing problems for her standing with her supervisor, and nothing I have done to reduce my presence has made any difference." "She loses her composure when you're in the room," Dane said. "Yes. And nowhere else." "Correct. And you've been trying to solve this by making it harder for her to see you." "I've been trying to solve it by reducing the number of incidents that get reported to her supervisor." Aldrich Dane said, "She likes you." I did not say anything. "Do you like her?" I had been asking myself some version of that question for 3 weeks. The not saying anything went on for slightly longer than it should have for a person who had a simple answer. "You don't have to tell me," Dane said, "but you should probably figure it out before you make things worse by continuing to disappear." "I am not disappearing. I am adjusting my routing." "Yes," she said. "That is what disappearing looks like when it is wearing a professional justification." A pause. "You know what you're actually doing, right? You're trying to solve her problem for her by removing yourself, and she doesn't want you removed. That's the whole thing." I thought about that. "Call me back when you've thought about it," Dane said and disconnected. I had, if I am honest, been thinking about it since the 2nd week of Thessavin's posting. The thinking had not been comfortable. She was 29 years by the Velorath conversion, which maps to the late 30s in human terms, younger than me, but not in the way that mattered. She was assigned to observe my operation and produce an assessment that would presumably travel up the Compact's diplomatic chain, which meant she was, in a professional sense, my evaluator as much as my observer. The bilateral exchange agreement had language in it about non-fraternization between Union staff and diplomatic observers. The language was not prohibitive, but it was present. None of that was what I was actually thinking about. I was thinking about the way she held herself when she was composed, which was most of the time when I was not in the room, and the specific quality of her attention when she was taking notes, which was thorough in the way of someone who genuinely wants to understand what they are seeing, not merely document it. I was thinking about a question she had asked my adjutant 3 weeks in about the purpose of the counter-rotation drill I'd been running with the advanced cohort, a question Cora had brought to me because Cora hadn't been certain of the answer. And the answer was that the counter-rotation drill existed to teach fighters to disengage from an established rhythm without telegraphing the break, which is a harder skill than it sounds, and one most trainers don't teach until the intermediate level. When Cora had relayed my answer, Thessavin had apparently stopped writing for a moment and then written for rather a long time. I was thinking about the fact that she was the remainder of the remainder, assigned to a posting no one else wanted, carrying the weight of a report that would be used by people above her with little regard for what it cost her. And she was doing the work anyway with a thoroughness that would have made her an asset in any program I ran. I went back to Cora the next morning. "I need to understand the composure assessment protocol," I said. "Specifically, what Vorin can file and when." Cora pulled the relevant section. "He can file an informal observation at any point during the posting. A formal assessment requires documented evidence of at least 3 significant composure failures within a 30-day window, or 1 severe failure. Significant is defined as a physical disruption of the observer's duties or environment. Severe is not precisely defined, which means it's at his discretion." "What constitutes the end of a posting?" "Either the completion of the observation term, she has 11 weeks remaining, or a recall order from the Compact, which Vorin can trigger by filing the formal assessment." 11 weeks. I looked at the training schedule. Is the assessment filed through the Compact's own process, or does it come through the station's administrative channel? "Both," Compact files internally, and a copy goes to station admin as part of the exchange agreement. Which means if Voren files, command sees it. Yes. I thought about it. Can I file anything? Cora looked at me carefully. In what sense? In the sense of, is there a mechanism by which a Union garrison officer can register a formal observation about the conduct of a diplomatic exchange, or about the assessment process itself, that would carry weight in the compact's review? Cora was quiet for a moment. I'd have to look at the exchange agreement more carefully, but I believe there's a provision for host facility assessment of the exchange program's operational conduct. Section 12, I think. Find it, I said. She found it. Section 12 of the bilateral exchange agreement granted the senior Union officer at the host facility the right to submit a program assessment to the Joint Oversight Committee, which reviewed exchange postings quarterly. It was a bureaucratic mechanism, not a dramatic one, but it was something. It meant that if Voren filed a recall request, there was a channel through which I could formally register that the exchange program had been operating effectively, and that the observer in question had been conducting her duties with diligence. It also meant I needed to be more careful about what was happening in my own yard. I changed tactics. I stopped trying to be invisible. That had clearly accomplished nothing except making me leave the mess hall early, which was undignified, and it had done nothing to reduce the number of incidents that Voren was presumably cataloging. If the variable was my presence and not my proximity, then the solution was not to reduce my presence, but to make my presence consistent enough that it stopped being a disruption. I began, the following week, to make my morning routine predictable. Same entry point back to the North Corridor. Same timing. Same path across the yard. I was present in the observation walkway area during the period when she was most often there, and I was not pretending I was somewhere else. I did not address her directly. I did not try to interact with her, because I was fairly certain that direct interaction was not going to help her composure. But I stopped moving around her as if she were a weather pattern I was trying to avoid, because that had not worked, and it had made me feel as if I were doing something wrong, which I was not. What I was doing, I told myself, was being consistent. What I was actually doing, I knew, was deciding to be present. Not to perform presence, not to signal anything, but to stop subtracting myself from a room where I belonged, because she could see the subtraction, and the subtraction was its own disruption. A man who walks a different way every morning because he is managing your reaction is doing something more intrusive than a man who simply walks the same way and trusts you to handle it. That is what Dane had meant. I understood it 3 days after she said it, which is my usual pace with things Dane says. The incidents did not stop entirely, but they changed in character. The things she dropped became smaller. The pauses in her sentences shortened. I noticed carefully from my peripheral vision, because I had learned that direct eye contact from across the room was categorically its own kind of disruption, that she was beginning to anticipate my entry point in the morning, and that the anticipation itself was something she had started to manage. She would orient slightly toward the North Corridor about 2 minutes before I came through it, and when I appeared instead of the previous reaction, there was a small stillness, like a breath taken and held, and then she returned to her notes. This was, I decided, progress. Cora did not comment on any of it directly. She simply continued handling the administrative interface with the Velorath observers and bringing me the occasional observation, worded with the careful neutrality she uses when she is telling me something she knows I already know. Senior Observer Voren requested the station's communication logs from the last 30 days, she said one morning. Standard observer access, which the exchange agreement permits. What specifically? He didn't specify. Broad access request. I nodded. And the program assessment mechanism, is there a filing window? Quarterly submissions are due at the end of the current posting period, which aligns with approximately week 10 of her remaining 11. So in about 9 weeks. Yes. All right. I went back to the yard. On week 7 of Thesivin's remaining term, she spoke to me directly for the first time. I was at the equipment rack at the end of the day, logging the training poles back in, which is a mundane task I do myself because I prefer to know what condition my equipment is in, and I heard her footsteps on the yard surface. The Velorath have a slightly different gait distribution, more weight toward the midfoot, which produces a distinctive sound on station decking, and then she stopped about 4 meters away. I did not turn around. I kept logging the poles in. "Instructor Senna," she said. Her voice, when she was composed, was precise in the way of someone who learned Union standard from formal instruction rather than immersion. Every word was placed cleanly, the same way her notes were placed cleanly. There was a small pause before my name, the kind of pause that means the speaker prepared the sentence in advance and is now executing it rather than constructing it in real time. "Observer on rail," I said without turning around. A pause. "I have a question about the counter-rotation sequence. Your adjutant forwarded my earlier inquiry. I am asking a follow-up." "All right." "The break in the rhythm. You train the advanced cohort to initiate it on the 3rd count rather than the 4th. Your adjutant confirmed that. I wanted to ask why the 3rd. I finished logging the last pole and turned around then, because having a conversation with someone's back is discourteous, and I had spent enough weeks being artificially careful about where I pointed my eyes. She was standing with her tablet under her arm. She was wearing her observer's sash over the Velorath working uniform, which is a close-cut design in deep gray blue with a minimal rank notation on the collar. Her silver-ash hair was pulled back in the formal style she wore during official observation periods. She had not dropped anything. She was looking at me with an expression that was almost composed. There was the faintest trace of something at the corners of her eyes, a kind of effort, like a person who is carrying a weight they have decided no one is going to see them carry. I answered the question about the 3rd count because it was a good question. The 3rd count is where the natural rhythm of the sequence places the center of gravity slightly forward, which is where most fighters put weight to initiate an extension. If you break on the 3rd, you're breaking at the moment your opponent expects commitment. Breaking on the 4th means you've already committed and the break reads as a flinch. The 3rd count break reads as a choice. She wrote while I talked. She did not lose her grip on anything. When I finished, she looked up from the tablet. "That is consistent with the Velorath preference for preemptive disengagement over reactive disengagement," she said, and then she paused, and something crossed her face that was not precisely calculation. It was more like someone deciding whether to say the next thing. "We call it on Velath, choosing before you are forced." "That's a useful concept," I said. "Yes," she said, and then she went back through the south corridor with her notes, and that was the end of the conversation. I stood in the equipment yard for a moment, logging nothing. Cora was at the administrative terminal when I came in. She had that expression again. "Not a word," I said. "I wasn't going to say anything," she said, with absolute sincerity. On week 9, Vorin called a formal composure assessment meeting. Cora informed me at 600, which is when she gets the administrative notifications. The meeting was scheduled for 1400 in the station's diplomatic conference room, and it included Thesivin Vorin, the station's diplomatic liaison, a Union officer named Penrath who mostly handles the paperwork, and, at Vorin's request, me. I sat across the table from Vorin and said nothing while Penrath ran through the procedural requirements, which were standard, and which everyone in the room had already read. Thesivin sat to Vorin's right, with her tablet on the table in front of her and her hands folded on top of it, and she was entirely composed, in the way she was composed when I was not looking directly at her. She was very carefully not looking at me. Voren laid out the formal observations he had documented. He was precise and unhurried about it, the way of someone who had prepared this particular document many times. 7 composure failures over the first 4 weeks of the observation term, 3 in the subsequent 4 weeks, 1 in the week following. A clear documented trend of improvement, he acknowledged, which he attributed in his assessment to the observer's increased focus on self-discipline under corrective guidance. He recommended a conditional completion. She would be permitted to finish the observation term, but her assessment would carry a composure notation that would follow her record. The notation, Penrath said, reviewing the document, would preclude assignment to senior postings for a period of 3 years. That is the protocol, Voren said. I looked at Thesavin. She was looking at the table. I have a question, I said. Voren looked at me. The Union Host Facility Assessment Provision, I said, allows me to register a formal observation about the program's operational conduct. I'd like to do that now for the record. Penrath looked at the exchange agreement on his own tablet. That's technically for end-of-term submission to the Joint Oversight Committee, not for inclusion in the composure assessment. I know, but the record of this meeting goes to the Joint Oversight Committee, and I want my observation on it before this meeting concludes. Penrath thought about it. Voren said nothing, which I took as permission. Observer on-rails assessment work has been, in my observation, the most thorough I have seen from any external evaluator in 12 years of running this training program. She asked questions that went beyond the scope of a standard bilateral assessment. She followed those questions with cross-referencing that I know because Cora told me takes time that the observation schedule does not formally allocate, which means she was doing additional work on her own time. The composure incidents, documented by senior observer Voren, were real. They were also, and I am stating this formally for the record, not caused by any deficiency in observer on-rails professional discipline. They were caused by my presence in the room. I was the disrupting variable. She compensated for it progressively and continued to produce rigorous work throughout. There was a brief silence. That is not the relevant standard, Voren said. The relevant standard is the maintenance of on-Vedrath regardless of environmental variables. I understand. I am not contesting the standard. I am providing context for the record that I think the Joint Oversight Committee should have when it reviews any notation attached to her file. Voren looked at me with the flat, measuring attention he used on everything. You are an environmental variable, he said, with the small precision of someone making a categorization. Your disruptive effect on the observer's composure is a matter of record. Yes, I said. And you believe this constitutes a mitigating circumstance. I believe it constitutes a context that the notation does not capture. Another silence. Voren looked down at his document. He was not, I thought, an unreasonable person. He was a person who operated by very specific rules and who had been applying those rules honestly. The rules did not have a provision for what I was describing, which was not a reason to ignore the description. It was Thesavin who spoke next. She had not moved. Her hands were still folded on her tablet, but she looked up not at Voren, not at Penrath. At me. Instructor Senna, she said. Her voice was doing the thing it did when she was preparing a sentence in advance, but it was steadier than I had heard it. Did you know? I had not been expecting the question, which is perhaps why I answered it without any particular preparation. I had a reasonable suspicion, I said, by week 4. And you continued to be present in the yard. Yes. You adjusted your routine, your entry point, your timing on the walkway. Yes. Her eyes were the dark wine color that catches the light the same way deep water catches it, and she looked at me with an expression that I did not fully read at the time and have spent considerable time understanding since. It was not accusation. It was something more careful than that. Something that was still asking. Why, she said. Because you were doing good work, I said, and because removing myself wasn't the right answer. That is not the only reason, she said. I looked at her for a moment. No, I said, it is not. The room was very quiet. Voren was looking at his document. Penrath was looking at his tablet. They were both looking at their respective surfaces with the studied attention of people who have decided they are not present for whatever is happening. Senior Observer Voren, Thesavin said, without looking away from me. I request a 15-minute procedural pause. Voren looked up at that. He looked at her, and then he looked at me, and something shifted in his flat amber expression. A procedural pause is permitted under the assessment protocol, he said. 15 minutes. He and Penrath left the room. The door closed behind them. We sat across the table from each other in the diplomatic conference room of Threshold Station Kelvara, and I waited, because I had the strong impression that something was still being decided. I am going to ask you a direct question, Thesavin said, in the Velorath formal register. All right. The formal register requires a truthful answer or a formal refusal. There is no non-answer. I understand. She set her tablet on the table, hands flat on the surface. The gesture, I learned later, is a Velorath formal posture, hands uncovered, unheld, open. It means what the speaker is about to say has not been prepared for management. Do you intend to be present in my life beyond the conclusion of this posting? She said. I did not have a prepared answer because I had not expected the question, because I had not expected the meeting to go the way it was going. What I had was what I said, which I had been thinking for approximately 7 weeks without permission. I was waiting to be asked, I said. She looked at me for a long time. The expression that crossed her face was the most composed thing I had seen from her since her arrival, which was paradoxical, and which I understood a moment later. She was not maintaining her composure. It was simply there, because the thing she had been bracing against had resolved in the direction she had not let herself expect, and the bracing had released. The compact has a formal bonding declaration process, she said. Under Section 41 of the Diplomatic Auxiliary Charter, a junior observer may file a bonding declaration with a Union national during an active posting, provided the declaration is submitted during the final observation period and carries endorsement from the relevant program officer. I looked at her. Cora is the program officer of record. I know. She would need to be asked. I know, she said again. I think her answer would be yes. Thesavin looked down at her hands, which were still flat on the table. Something went through her expression that was not quite a smile and was entirely a smile. The first time I saw you walk across that yard, she said, not in the formal register which I noticed, I dropped my tablet. I know. I have been dropping things, or nearly dropping things for 11 weeks. I know. That is, she said carefully, not my normal character. I know that too, I said. It's all right. She looked up. The wine-dark eyes caught the station light. It was not all right. It was profoundly inconvenient. Yes, I agreed, for both of us. There was a pause, and in the pause, she made a sound that I recognized a moment later as a laugh, brief and private, like something she had not planned to allow out, caught by surprise. I had not, in 11 weeks of watching her try to hold herself together in my vicinity, seen her laugh. It was better than I had expected. Voren and Penrath came back at the 15-minute mark. The assessment meeting concluded with my formal observation entered into the record and Voren's composure notation revised, after a brief procedural discussion, to reflect the contextual circumstances I had documented, which meant the 3-year preclusion was reduced to an informal advisory. It was not nothing. It was not what I had hoped for, but it was better than what it had been. Thesavin filed the bonding declaration at 2300 that evening. I know the timing because Cora told me the next morning, And because the digital timestamp was the same time I stopped trying to sleep and sat at my desk and read it 3 times. The declaration itself was 5 pages. Velorath legal documents do not use the same economy of language that union administrative filings use. They are written in a layered structure, with the formal statement of intent at the center and a series of supporting clauses that expand outward from it like rings. The outermost rings are procedural, establishing the legal context. The inner rings are specific, detailing the basis for the declaration. The innermost ring, the core statement, was 4 sentences. I read those 4 sentences more than 3 times. In Union Standard Translation, the last of them read, "The Onthesar is filed in recognition that the subject of this declaration has demonstrated, over the full term of the observation posting, consistent and unreserved regard for the person of the filer, not her rank, not her function, not her professional usefulness, and that this regard was present from an early period and did not diminish under the conditions of the posting, which were materially unfavorable to its expression." Consistent and unreserved regard. I sat with that for a while. Cora's endorsement was already attached. She had filed it at 22:59, which was the exact same moment the declaration became available for endorsement, which means Cora had been waiting at her terminal with her finger over the submission key. I did not say anything about this to Cora, and she did not say anything about it to me, which is the nature of our working relationship. The bonding declaration in Velorath diplomatic law is not a marriage. It is a formal statement of intent that opens a period of mutual recognition, what the compact calls Onthesar, approximately the time of being seen. It carries legal weight in the sense that it places both parties in a recognized relationship structure for the duration of the period and grants certain administrative protections to the Velorath national who has filed. The protection that mattered in this case was that a bonding declaration, once filed and endorsed, superseded the composure notation in Voron's assessment. He informed me of this the following morning in the corridor outside the administrative office. He stopped and looked at me with the flat amber attention he used for cataloging things. He had his document case under one arm and his hands clasped behind him, the posture of someone who has decided to have a conversation they were not previously planning to have. "You knew about the supersession provision," he said. "I did not," I said, which was true. I had not read Section 41 of the Diplomatic Auxiliary Charter because I had not known Section 41 of the Diplomatic Auxiliary Charter existed. He looked at me for a moment. "You were the environmental variable," he said. "Yes." "The composure failures were caused by your presence." "Yes." "And you remained present in the yard every day for 11 weeks." "Yes." He looked down the corridor toward the training yard, and then back at me. The flat amber expression had shifted slightly in a direction I did not immediately categorize. "Our junior observers," he said, "are rarely sent to postings that require them to do anything difficult. They are sent to postings we can afford to lose." He paused. "I have known Thesavin Onrail for 6 years. She has spent those 6 years being told in various ways that she is the kind of person we can afford to lose." He looked at me again. "She asked you a question in the formal register." "Yes." "That is not a small thing." I understood that. "Yes," he said after a moment. "I thought you might." And he continued down the corridor with the careful economy of a man who had said what he intended to say. I went to the training yard. It was 6:45. Primary session would not begin for 40 minutes. Thesavin was already there. She was at the observation rail on the elevated walkway, which was where she had been every morning for 11 weeks. She had her tablet. She was making notes, or she appeared to be making notes. I could not see the tablet from the yard floor, and it was possible she was making notes, or it was possible she was simply standing there with a tablet, which amounts to the same thing. I went to the equipment rack and began logging the training poles out, which is what I do every morning at the start of primary session. The same routine, the same path. I heard her at the walkway rail stop writing. I did not turn around. I pulled the first pole and began the assessment, running my hand down the length to feel for any stress in the composite, which is a habit I have had since an undetected hairline fracture took out a trainee's left eye in a different program years before this one, and which is why I do the equipment logging myself. "Instructor Senna," she said. "Observer on rail," I said. A pause, a shorter pause than the first time in the equipment yard 7 weeks ago. "I have a question." "All right." The counter-rotation sequence, the third count break. "You said it reads as a choice rather than a flinch." "That's right." Another pause. "Choosing before you are forced," she said, the phrase she had taught me. "Is that what you did when you came back through the North Corridor, when you stopped making yourself invisible?" I thought about it. "Yes," I said, "I think that's what I did." I heard her exhale, a small sound, controlled and deliberate, the one she makes when she has released something she had been carrying. "That is on Veleth," she said. "I know," I said, "you taught me." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "The word for what I filed last night, the declaration. In Velorath it is on Thessar." "You told me." "The time of being seen." "The full translation," she said carefully, as though she was measuring something, "is more specific than that. On is the formal marker for a recognized mutual relationship. Thessar does not mean seen. Thessar means the one who did not look away." I kept my hand on the training pole. The station was quiet around us in the early morning, the way stations are quiet before the people fill them up again. "The one who did not look away," I said. "Yes." I set down the pole I had been holding and turned around then, and looked up at the observation walkway, where she was standing with her tablet and her formal observer's sash and her silver-ash hair and her wine-dark eyes that caught the station light even at this distance. She was looking back at me with the steadiest expression I had seen on her face since she arrived at Threshold Station Kelvara. Not performed, not managed, simply there, the way composure looks when it is not something you are maintaining but something you have arrived at on the other side of something that required arriving. "Good morning, Thessavin," I said. "Good morning, Aldrich," she said. And that was the first time she used my given name, and the training polls could wait, and the primary session could start a few minutes late, and I stood in the yard below the observation walkway and looked up at her, until Cora came through the North Corridor at 7:10 and took one look at the situation and turned directly around and went back out the way she had come. I did not blame her. Some things do not need a third person in the room. 11 weeks later, I submitted the host facility assessment for the Joint Oversight Committee. It ran to 9 pages. Cora helped me with the formatting, which she did without comment. Section 6 contained a formal recommendation for the elevation of observer on-rails posting classification from junior to senior, based on the quality of the assessment she had produced and the depth of the methodology she had demonstrated. The recommendation was adopted 7 months later. I know because Thessavin told me, in the message she sent the morning the committee's decision came through, which was the 44th message she had sent me since the end of her posting, each one precise and careful, and more like herself with each iteration. The message said, "They have made the notation, senior observer, third posting allocated." The committee cited Instructor Senna's assessment in the elevation report. And then, after a pause that I could feel even across the distance between us, I chose the posting on Threshold Station. I asked to return. I did not ask anyone's permission to do so. I read it twice. I read it a third time, which is becoming a habit with her messages. Then I wrote back, "The North Corridor is yours." She arrived on a Tuesday in the late morning, when the training yard is between sessions, and the station is running on the low hum of its ordinary operations. I was at the equipment rack. The polls were already logged out. I heard her footsteps on the approach corridor, midfoot distribution, the particular sound of someone who has a distinctive gait and does not try to change it. And then she came through the north corridor into the yard. She had her tablet. She had her observer's sash, the senior designation now, a wider band. Her hair was still pulled back in the formal style. Her hands were at her sides and they were steady, and she walked across the training yard in the early afternoon light and stopped 2 meters away and looked at me with the wine-dark eyes that catch the light and said, with absolute precision and no preparation, the way of someone who has decided to stop managing. I did not lose anything coming through that door. I looked at her. No, I said. You didn't. She nodded once, the way the Velorath nod when something has been confirmed that they already knew. Then she looked at the training yard around us, the equipment rack, the floor markings, the elevated walkway, the south corridor where Cora would appear in approximately 4 minutes to begin the afternoon session, and something in her expression settled, the way water settles when it stops being moved by something external. She was, for the first time since I had known her, exactly where she meant to be. I have questions, she said, about the secondary drill sequence. There are inconsistencies in my earlier notes that I want to correct. All right, I said. She opened her tablet. She held it without dropping it. And that, of all the moments I have accumulated over the considerable length of this particular professional and personal complication, is the one I keep returning to. The morning light on the station yard, the sound of her footsteps through the north corridor, and the completely ordinary act of a woman opening a tablet and beginning to work, unbraced, without armor, without the weight of a performance no one should have required of her. I did not look away. I have not looked away since.